Welcome to Just Stories. We hope you enjoy the story. The Battle for Supremacy, the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871, by Just Stories. Chapter 1, The Prelude to War, Bismarck's Machinations and French Ambitions. Welcome to the first chapter of The Battle for Supremacy, the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871. In this chapter, we'll explore the political and diplomatic events that led up to the outbreak of war, including the machinations of Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and the ambitions of the French government. In the years leading up to 1870, Europe was undergoing significant political change. The German states were in the process of unification, and tensions were high between France and Prussia. Bismarck, a master politician and strategist, saw an opportunity to further his goals of creating a unified German state under Prussian leadership. Bismarck's first step was to isolate France diplomatically. He sought alliances with other European powers, particularly Austria-Hungary and Russia, in order to ensure that if war did break out with France, Prussia would not be fighting alone. He also worked to improve relations with Britain, which had traditionally been wary of Prussian expansionism. At the same time, Bismarck was careful to provoke France just enough to keep them on edge, but not enough to justify an immediate attack. He maneuvered skillfully in a number of crises and conflicts that strained relations between the two countries, including a dispute over the Spanish throne in 1868. Meanwhile, the French government was also looking to assert its dominance on the European stage. Emperor Napoleon III, who had seized power in a coup in 1851, was eager to bolster his legitimacy and reputation. He saw a conflict with Prussia as a way to achieve this, and also believed that a military victory would help distract the French people from domestic problems and unify the country. The French military was also confident in its abilities. The army had undergone significant modernization and expansion in the years following the Crimean War, and the French believed they had a superior fighting force to the Prussians. However, as tensions continued to mount between France and Prussia, it became clear that war was inevitable. Bismarck, having secured his alliances and made his preparations, was ultimately able to provoke France into declaring war in July 1870. So, that's a brief overview of the political and diplomatic landscape leading up to the Franco-German War. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the details of the opening stages of the conflict, including the mobilization of troops and the initial skirmishes and battles. Stay tuned. Chapter 2, Mobilization and Opening Moves, August-September 1870. Welcome back to the Battle for Supremacy, the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871. In this chapter, we'll explore the opening stages of the conflict, from the mobilization of troops to the initial skirmishes and battles between French and German forces. Following the declaration of war by France on July 19, 1870, both sides began the process of mobilizing their armies. The French army, commanded by Marshal Patrice de MacMahon, had a total strength of around 300,000 men, while the German army, under the leadership of Helmuth von Moltke, had around 400,000 men. The mobilization process was a logistical challenge for both sides. Troops had to be transported to the front lines, supplies had to be gathered and distributed, and communication networks had to be established. However, the German army had a significant advantage in terms of rail transport, which allowed them to move troops and supplies quickly and efficiently. By early August, both armies had reached their positions on the border between France and Germany. The French had deployed their forces in the northeast, while the Germans were concentrated in the south and west. The first significant clash between French and German forces came on August 4th, when a French cavalry patrol clashed with a Prussian detachment at Wissembourg in Alsace. The French were initially successful, but were later forced to retreat when German reinforcements arrived. This skirmish was followed by a larger battle at Spicheren on August 6th, in which the German army was able to repel a French attack and secure a victory. The French army, which had been planning to launch a major offensive in the region, was forced to regroup and reconsider its strategy. Over the next few weeks, both sides engaged in a series of smaller skirmishes and battles along the border. The French attempted to mount several counterattacks, but were unable to make significant headway against the better organized and more disciplined German army. One key factor in the early stages of the war was the use of railway transport. The German army was able to move troops and supplies quickly and efficiently using the railway network, while the French were hampered by a lack of coordination and logistical challenges. As the summer drew to a close, both armies were preparing for larger and more decisive battles. The French were planning to launch a major offensive in the northeast, while the Germans were looking to advance towards Paris. The stage was set for a dramatic and pivotal chapter in the conflict. That concludes our overview of the mobilization and opening moves of the Franco-German War. In the next chapter, we'll explore the siege of Paris and the impact it had on the course of the conflict. Chapter 3, The Siege of Paris, September 1870 to January 1871. Welcome back to the battle for supremacy, the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871. In this chapter, we'll delve into one of the defining moments of the war, the Siege of Paris. Following the German victory at the Battle of Sedan on September 2, 1870, the French army was effectively defeated and the way was clear for the German army to advance on Paris. However, rather than launch a direct assault on the city, the Germans opted to lay siege to it. The Siege of Paris lasted for over 4 months, from September 19, 1870, to January 28, 1871. The German army, under the command of Crown Prince Frederick William, encircled the city and cut off all supply lines, leaving the inhabitants to face hunger, disease, and hardship. The situation in Paris was dire. Food supplies were quickly exhausted, and people were forced to eat whatever they could find, including rats and horses. Fuel and other basic necessities were also scarce, and the city was plagued by outbreaks of disease, including cholera. The French government, which had fled to Tours in the south, made several attempts to break the siege and relieve the city. They launched a series of balloon flights to transport mail and supplies, and attempted to organize a number of sorties to break through the German lines. However, these efforts were largely unsuccessful, and the situation in the city continued to deteriorate. The international community was also closely watching the situation in Paris. Several attempts were made to broker a ceasefire and negotiate a peace settlement, but the Germans, who were confident of victory, refused to consider any terms that did not involve a French surrender. As the winter set in, the situation in Paris became increasingly desperate. People were dying of starvation and disease, and morale was at an all-time low. However, the French government refused to give up, and continued to hold out hope for a breakthrough. In the end, it was the internal divisions within the French government that led to the surrender of Paris. On January 28, 1871, the city's mayor, Jules Favre, signed an armistice with the Germans, effectively ending the siege and paving the way for the eventual peace settlement. The impact of the Siege of Paris on the course of the war was significant. It tied up a large portion of the German army and prevented them from advancing on other fronts, while also severely weakening the French military and government. It also had a profound psychological impact on the French people, who were left traumatized by the experience of being besieged in their own city. That concludes our overview of the Siege of Paris. In the next chapter, we'll explore the battles of the Loire and the attempts by the French to mount a counteroffensive against the Germans. Chapter 4, The Battles of the Loire, December 1870 to January 1871. Welcome back to the battle for supremacy, the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871. In this chapter, we'll explore the battles of the Loire, a series of engagements fought between French and German forces in the late stages of the war. Following the surrender of Paris in January 1871, the French government was forced to relocate to the city of Tours, in the Loire Valley. From there, they attempted to organize a counteroffensive against the Germans, who were advancing towards the city. The French army, commanded by General Louis d'Aurelle de Paladins, was heavily outnumbered and outgunned by the Germans. However, they were determined to make a stand and defend their homeland from further invasion. The first major battle of the Loire campaign was fought at Orleans on December 2, 1870. The French were able to repel a German attack and secure a victory, but they suffered heavy casualties in the process. The battle was a morale boost for the French, who saw it as a sign that they could still fight and win against the Germans. Over the next few weeks, a series of smaller skirmishes and battles were fought between the two sides. The French were attempting to hold off the German advance and buy time for reinforcements to arrive, while the Germans were looking to push forward and secure a decisive victory. One key engagement during this period was the Battle of Le Mans on January 12 to 13, 1871. The French army was able to launch a surprise attack on the Germans and inflict heavy losses, but they were ultimately forced to retreat when German reinforcements arrived. Despite the successes of the French army, they were ultimately unable to stop the German advance. The German army, which had been reinforced with fresh troops, continued to push towards the Loire Valley, and the French were forced to retreat to the south. The battles of the Loire were significant in that they showed that the French army was still capable of mounting a resistance against the Germans, despite the overwhelming odds against them. They also highlighted the importance of morale and determination in times of war, and showed that a determined force could achieve significant victories even against a more powerful enemy. However, ultimately the French were unable to mount a successful counteroffensive, and the German army was able to secure a decisive victory in the conflict. The aftermath of the war would have profound consequences for both France and Germany, and would shape the course of European history for decades to come. That concludes our overview of the battles of the Loire. In the next chapter, we'll explore the endgame of the war, including the negotiations that took place between the French and German governments and the eventual peace settlement. Chapter 5, The Endgame, February to March 1871. Welcome back to the Battle for Supremacy, the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871. In this chapter, we'll explore the endgame of the conflict, including the negotiations that took place between the French and German governments and the eventual peace settlement. Following the battles of the Loire, the French government was forced to retreat to Bordeaux, in the southwest of the country. There, they attempted to regroup and organize a last-ditch defense against the German advance. However, the situation was hopeless for the French. The German army had a significant advantage in terms of troops and resources, and the French government knew that they could not hold out much longer. In early February 1871, negotiations began between the two sides, with the aim of securing a peace settlement. The negotiations were difficult and often contentious. The French government was eager to secure favorable terms, while the Germans were determined to secure a decisive victory and ensure that France would not be a threat in the future. One key issue was the question of reparations. The Germans demanded that France pay a significant sum of money to cover the costs of the war, while the French argued that such demands were unfair and would cripple their economy. Another issue was the question of territorial concessions. The Germans had already annexed the region of Alsace-Lorraine, which had been a point of contention between the two countries for decades. However, they also demanded control over other areas of France, including the city of Belfort. In the end, the French government was forced to accept harsh terms in order to secure a peace settlement. The Treaty of Frankfurt, signed on May 10, 1871, required France to cede Alsace-Lorraine to Germany and pay an indemnity of 5 billion francs. The treaty also required France to reduce its army and demobilize a significant portion of its forces. The impact of the treaty was significant. It left France humiliated and weakened, while also cementing Germany's position as the dominant power in Europe. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine would be a source of tension and conflict between France and Germany for decades to come, and would contribute to the outbreak of World War I. The endgame of the Franco-German War was a sobering reminder of the costs and consequences of war. It highlighted the importance of diplomacy and negotiation in resolving conflicts, and showed that even the most determined and capable military force could not always achieve victory. That concludes our overview of the endgame of the war. In the final chapter, we'll explore the legacy and impact of the Franco-German War and its lasting effects on European history. Chapter 6, The Legacy and Impact, 1871 to Present. Welcome to the final chapter of the Battle for Supremacy, the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871. In this chapter, we'll explore the legacy and impact of the conflict, and how it shaped the course of European history in the decades and centuries that followed. One of the most significant legacies of the Franco-German War was the impact it had on the balance of power in Europe. The defeat of France and the rise of Germany as a dominant power had far-reaching consequences for the continent and set the stage for the conflicts and tensions that would characterize the 20th century. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine was a source of tension and resentment for the French people and contributed to a sense of bitterness and mistrust towards Germany. The French government was determined to regain control of the region, and this desire would play a significant role in the outbreak of World War I. The Franco-German War also had a profound impact on the development of military technology and tactics. The war was notable for its use of rail transport, telegraphy, and other modern innovations, and demonstrated the importance of logistics and communications in modern warfare. The war also had a significant impact on the arts and culture of the time. The war and its aftermath inspired a wave of artistic and literary works, including paintings, novels, and poetry. These works often explored themes of patriotism, heroism, and sacrifice, and helped to shape the cultural landscape of Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Another legacy of the war was the impact it had on the development of nationalism and nation-states in Europe. The war and its aftermath helped to solidify the identities and boundaries of the various European nations and contributed to the rise of nationalism and the development of nation-states in the region. Today, the legacy of the Franco-German War continues to be felt in Europe and around the world. The war and its aftermath helped to shape the course of European history in the decades and centuries that followed, and continue to influence political, cultural, and social developments in the region today. In conclusion, the Franco-German War of 1870 to 1871 was a pivotal moment in European history, with far-reaching consequences for the continent and the world. It demonstrated the costs and consequences of war and highlighted the importance of diplomacy and negotiation in resolving conflicts. Its legacy and impact continue to be felt today and serve as a reminder of the importance of learning from the past in order to shape a better future. Thank you for watching our video. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on our next story.